I don't think our metrics for success are adequate or realistic. I don't think we know what greatness looks like or tastes like or feels like. I think that school has an obligation to introduce children to things they don't yet know they love and to create the conditions in which they might become really good at those things.
As the age of AI accelerates, schools around the world are being asked to redefine their purpose. At least they should be. As I've discussed previously on several shows, if artificial intelligence can write code and solve problems at a higher level than most students, and even teachers, the question then becomes, what is school for? It's a question that brings us to the heart of today's podcast. In this episode of Education Matters, I speak with Dr. Gary Steger, a provocative and powerful voice in education, whose decades of work, alongside legends like Seymour Papert, has helped shape the very foundation of progressive tech-infused learning. A jazz musician turned computer scientist turned educator, Gary's career has been one long fight for creativity, agency, and what he calls the art of teaching. Gary has worked across 6 continents, led one of the world's first one-to-one laptop initiatives, and trained thousands of educators in the power of project-based constructivist learning. He's the founder of Constructing Modern Knowledge, author of several books on education and jazz, and is an unapologetic advocate for giving kids more time to think, tinker, and make. In our conversation, we talk about why schools are still organized to sort and punish rather than to support and inspire, how teachers can reclaim their agency, and why scripted curriculum is a threat to both students and the profession at large, what jazz, coding, and real learning have in common, the danger of treating AI as just another tool instead of rethinking what learning actually means, why Gary believes the best education still comes from open-ended, personally meaningful projects with no rubrics or artificial constraints or predetermined outcomes, and why the most powerful question a teacher can ask is still, what do you want to make? Gary's critiques are sharp, but they're grounded in a deep love for children and learning. This is a lively, funny, and deeply thought-provoking conversation with someone who refuses to give up on what education could be. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Gary Steger. Gary Steger, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
I'm in beautiful downtown Torrance, California. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being on, Gary. I've come across your work, I think, through a mutual acquaintance in Dean Sharesky. But I've followed you certainly online and have been very intrigued by a lot of what I think the general public will view as kind of provocative statements, but I find them very interesting critiques of education. And that's one of the big reasons I was attracted to what you were doing. But then as I kind of dug into your background, there's just so much there that I want to talk to you about. But maybe you can start for the audience, just give folks a general sense of what you're up to these days, what keeps you busy.
A lot of my work is around making the world a better place for kids and helping teachers build their capacity and competence and confidence in doing so. I think the future viability of school is based on our ability to make every day the best 7 hours of a kid's life, and that schools have an obligation to introduce children to things they don't yet know they love. So I have a lot of eclectic ideas and forces that sort of converge around the idea of creating opportunities for kids to learn and do and express themselves in ways that were unimaginable just a couple of years ago, that really amplify the potential of each learner.
Well, I think you're in good company in this podcast and the audience that's listening here. But as always, I'd love to start with your background. Where and when did you grow up?
Well, I've given this some thought. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, about 25 miles from New York City, and experienced a quite unremarkable public school education in that suburban community. And despite what was probably a pretty terrible educational experience, filled with terrible boredom and bullying. There were kind of three things that got me through the whole system and the experience. One is that in the 7th grade, I learned to program computers, and around the same time, I fell in love with jazz and music composition. And despite the fact that some of these folks weren't particularly nice, and one might even accuse them of engaging in abuse, there were always teachers I could hang out with. And thinking about teachers and assuming their perspective, I think helped me both as a student and through my career as an educator. There were two events in junior high school, which is 6th, 7th, 8th grade, that had kind of long-term ramifications for me. I was just thinking about this last night. One was that during the 8th grade perfunctory meeting with my parents and the guidance counselor, where we had to come up with my schedule for 9th grade when I went off to high school. The guidance counselor was, just writing feverishly and said, well, and of course you'll take a study hall. And I went, whoa, 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 whoa. And he said, what's the matter with that? I said, study hall, that's where you sit and do nothing, right? He said, no, we think it's terribly important for you to study. And I was self-aware enough to realize that was a terrible idea. And that I had about 3 seconds to look through the list of courses offered by the high school and find one that I could say, that, I want to do that. And I chose music theory. And by choosing music theory 1 as a 9th grader, it meant that I had 4 years of music theory in high school, which I may be the only person in recorded history to have had 4 years of music theory in high school. They had the courses, they were approved for 1, 2, 3, and 4. But it was impossible to take 4 because no one ever discovered it until, they were 17 years old. And the second thing that happened, that really kind of infected my thinking about the nature of schooling ever since was, I don't know, this was before they were using terms like gifted and talented, and which I don't have much use for. I just remember in the 4th grade, the recommendation was to my parents, get him out of here. That was the best they could do. And my father just went, take off, you hoser, to speak Canadian. But in 6th grade or so, I apparently showed enough aptitude that I was invited to participate in something called Unified Math. And Unified Math was an accelerated, integrated mathematics curriculum track that took you out of the mainstream of math classes, and you were supposed to stay in it through the duration of middle school and high school. And so I started Unified Math in 7th grade, and then by the end of 8th grade, math education happened, and I wasn't doing well, and I felt stupid, and the teacher hated me, and I hated math. And by 9th grade, I had dropped out of Unified Math, and I was in one of the lowest sections of algebra. And what's really interesting about this is if you fast forward then to 12th grade, despite the fact that I was a fairly mediocre student, there was never any question that I would go to university somewhere. And so for 12th grade math, I took a class called Math for Liberal Arts. And it was kind of the math for dummies who plan to go on to higher education. And I remember vividly the first day of class, Ed O'Connor, the teacher, said, welcome, let me see if I can teach you the math my colleagues were supposed to have taught you. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And then I looked around the room, and I realized that a full 75% of my classmates in the dumb kid math class had started in Unified Math with me in 7th grade. And I remember thinking, oh, the fastest way to the bottom is from the top. And I wonder if any of the adults ever bothered to notice this. And to this day, I wonder if any of the adults ever bothered to notice that their grand scheme for improving math education was wrecking kids. And, along the way, I was programming computers the whole time. I was one of the best programmers in the school. And in fact, I had a class called Algebra 2 with Computer Programming in 1978, where we used the same shitty Algebra 2 textbook. I still can't tell you what Algebra 2 is. And if it's so good, why isn't there an Algebra 3? But we programmed computers to solve some of the problems. And it's remarkable that, 40 years later, we still don't offer those kinds of experiences for kids, and we still use the wrong symbol for multiplication in the math textbook. And I remember doing things like typing my math notebook in order to pass because compliance was more important than mathematical fluency. And figuring out that if I volunteered to be part of Geraldo Rivera's charity to build group homes for the mentally disabled, that was advised by the math teacher, that I could do better in math class. So, I got through. The punchline is I have a PhD in science and mathematics education. And I've been lucky enough in my life to have spent time in the company with some of the greatest mathematicians of the last century. Stephen Wolfram, Seymour Papert, Marvin Minsky. I spent a little time with John Conway, and not one of them ever made me feel stupid. But plenty of math teachers did.
Yeah. I have that exact experience with math in particular. But before, I can already start to see how these early experiences formed some of your later thinking in your work. But can I just ask a couple questions about what the environment was like where you grew up? So you seem to be a person with many interests, and it sounds like programming and music started pretty young. What do you remember being the first thing that you loved to learn?
My heroes as a child were Thomas Edison, Evel Knievel, and I just had it. J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, that's a unique group right there.
And I liked comedy. I liked satire. I liked the Little Rascals at Abbott Costello and the Marx Brothers. And, I watch the Little Rascals with my grandchildren now, and I can't help but think about the time in second grade when I organized a protest against the Arbor Day poetry that was sufficient to make my second grade teacher cry. But despite all that, I might have, been a little troublemaker and such. As I said before, I always had the kind of perspective of the teacher. So I was never a grade grubber, and I always kind of had this attitude of, hey, you've got a job to do, I've got a job to do. If I don't want to do the work and you want to penalize me for it, cool, that's the way it worked.
Right.
And despite, as I said before, despite the fact that I wasn't a particularly good student, there was just never any question that I was going to go to higher education. And then when I went on to college,
is that something derived from your parents? Like, did your parents kind of, because mine were, my father's a university professor, my mom an elementary school teacher, and the environment they created was just like, you go to university, that's what you do. And they never made it as something you do for a job, but it's just something you do for yourself as a human. So it was never like, I remember my friends asking in high school, like, are you going to university? I'm like, what do you mean? Aren't you going to university? That's just what you do. Was it like that?
Well, the suburb I grew up in, just about everybody did. My father was basically an entrepreneur and did a variety of different things. I only found out, well into adulthood, that the university he went to, that he talks about every day of his life because the experience was so rich for him, was the second university he went to because he flunked out of the first one. And the place that changed his life was the only place that would let him back in. My mother, at one point in my childhood, was the #1 Tupperware salesperson in America. And she had me young and didn't go to college because that wasn't something most women did. And, she could probably have taught any course at the Harvard Business School. She could sell things to women in trailer parks that they didn't need, like no one who ever lived. And we had a photocopier in my home from my earliest memories. We had 3 phone lines with buttons on my household phone. And so that was in the environment as well. But my mother worked after school and at night, and my father worked during the day. And so we were often left to our own devices. And that was all fine. I realize now that there were years during which I took music lessons from people that my parents never met. I was encouraged and allowed to do anything that I could get safely to and from without bothering them. And they would leave a check for me. And if they could make the concert, they did. And they were, if they could be den mothers or class parents, they tried their best to do that as well. But most of what I did there was no precedent for in my family. And it was probably because I was around a handful of great teachers. My two high school music teachers were both working jazz musicians. And I considered them friends and colleagues when I was 14, and they're still my friends and colleagues today. And I just wanted to be proximate to the kind of talent and genius and world that they inhabited. That, the president of Bard College in New York, who's an unbelievable public intellectual, says that he employs faculty who are, not were. And I was lucky enough to have some teachers in school who were great at things, or were certainly passionate about them. That they were the minority, but those were the ones who helped get me through. And I went to Berklee College of Music to study to be a jazz musician, which I pursued until my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me. And I did that rather than studying computer science at university, because I was told I couldn't study computer science because I wasn't good at math, despite the fact that by the time I graduated high school, spent 6 years programming computers, probably more than anything else that I'd ever done in my life.
Is there anything about your upbringing that you wish kids today could experience?
There was a certain amount of kind of responsible laissez-faireism to, like I said, my parents were busy. And the only conversation I remember having with my father about school was, he said, "I did school. It's your problem now." So they weren't, unless there was something really terrible going on or they got dragged into the school, they weren't going to get involved in it. And it only occurred to me recently that I changed colleges 3 or 4 times, and I don't think I ever discussed it with my parents. I mean, they were incredibly supportive, but it was kind of my life. And I think there's some weird stuff, I know people want to talk about social media and phones, and I think you shouldn't talk to strangers. You shouldn't get in the car with strangers. And I'm starting to play with the idea that perhaps we should let go of the notion that you're entitled to friends. I was playing tennis with a woman a couple of weeks ago who had to keep stopping the game to go to her phone because her teenage daughter was in distress. Now, I should tell you, her teenage daughter was at an amusement park with a dozen of her friends. And the distress was she found out that there was some other event she wasn't invited to.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, like, really? Your kid is calling you from an amusement park.
Yeah. Well, that's
to complain about her social,
that helicopter
to complain about her social
piece.
life. And like, yeah, just put the phone on Do Not Disturb. I mean, and yeah, so I think some of that, and then there was just luck. Because of the choices I made with high school, I took 2 music classes a day, my first 3 years of high school, and 3 music classes a day in 12th grade. Early on in 12th grade, right after I got my driver's license, I went to a concert at the local university that had one of the first jazz programs in America. And I saw a concert that so scrambled my DNA. I couldn't sleep that night. And I got up the next morning. I couldn't get it out of my head. And at the end of the school day, like I was programmed to do so biologically, or I hopped in my 1974 Gran Torino Elite and drove to the university, and I parked illegally, and I took my trumpet out of the trunk, and I walked into the music building, and I sat down on my trumpet case. And to this day, I don't know what I thought was going to happen. And this giant of a man threw open the rehearsal room door, looked at me down the hallway and said, "You." And I looked around and he said, "What? Kid, is that a trumpet?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Get in here." And I was kind of flustered, and I walked towards him. And as I approached the door, he pointed to the empty music stand and he said, "Third." And it meant, there was the third chair was open. And I played the rehearsal and I thanked him. It was great fun. It was the William Patterson College, now University Latin Jazz Band. And I thanked him for letting me sit in with the band. And he said, "You'll be here next week, right?" I said, "I don't go to school here." He said, "I don't care. I need a trumpet player." And he knew I wanted to be an arranger, so he paid me out of his pocket to copy charts for the band. He came to my house for free and gave me arranging lessons. Um, and that it was those kinds of experiences that changed my life with experts who loved what they did enough to take young people under their wing to ensure that what they do continues.
So you obviously love music and programming and find out that you have an interest in math, and you sounds like you did all of this in college. Was the calling to education similar to those other callings? Like, how did you figure out that you really wanted to teach?
I'll give you the sort of noble and the probably the honest answer. I came home from my freshman year in college at Christmas time, and my mother said, "Get a summer job." And I knew I could probably get a summer camp job. And so I applied to a number of summer camps to be the music counselor. And I was told that I was unqualified because I couldn't play the guitar. And then I stumbled into the office of this summer camp that's now third generation in New York State, about an hour from New York City. And the guy who was running the camp at the time, both he and his wife had PhDs, and he had a mini computer in his office. And I should tell you that when I graduated high school in 1981, after spending 6 years obsessively programming computers, I thought to myself, well, that was kind of fun, but nobody will ever have a computer. That's preposterous. And 6 months later, I'm trying to get a summer job. And this guy sees him. Well, you don't play the guitar, so that's not going to happen. Hey, I see you program computers in high school. We've been thinking about starting a computer programming project for kids. Would you be interested in leading that? And I said, yeah, maybe. I don't know. And and he asked me to write a program to solve some problem, and I can't remember what it was. And I had never seen his computer before, and I hadn't touched the computer at this point in 8 or 9 months. And I wrote the program, and it worked. And at 18 and a half years old, I was senior administration level of a 50-year-old beloved educational institution, and had a staff and a budget, and that summer began teaching kids to program computers. And not long after, I had another kind of accidental experience that led me to be teaching teachers. A few years later, when my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me, and I realized that Wynton Marsalis had come through town, and I had made a serious vocational error. I sort of pivoted it because I had to get a degree in something, and I ended up becoming an elementary education major. But the thing that happened with education and computers for me was, in high school, there was a guy named Dr. Henry Peterson, who was the mathematics supervisor for my school district. He's a gentleman who in 1962, I believe, brought a timeshare system to the school system, to the school district. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing. And I had actually seen a piece of computer hardware for the first time when I was in third grade, which would have been about 1973, because there was a terminal in the next classroom over where his wife was the third grade teacher. And by ninth grade, I had showed enough prowess that I was allowed to kind of run the timeshare mini computer mainframe system, and had keys to the office and a secretary who would take my phone calls and take my phone messages, and was told every night, have fun, lock up when you're done. So I go off to college to be a jazz musician, and I come home. I get this summer job. I teach kids how to program all summer, and a lot of my instincts about that were really good, and I'm doing the exact same work today. I could explain it better now, but I had good instincts then. And I ran into Henry Peterson in a supermarket, and I told him that I had just spent 2 or 3 months teaching kids to program. And he said, "That's great." And a couple weeks later, I got a phone call from him out of the blue, and he said, and this is remarkable and tells you about the time. He says, we're running this 12-week logo programming class for educators. Now, now you get 12 minutes. If it's a conference, there's 6 speakers in 12 minutes. And there's going to be a game show in the middle. But this was a 12-week computer programming class for educators using a logo programming language. And he said, we've got a guy from Rutgers teaching the course, and he's murdering these people. And they're calling me up complaining that they can't keep up. He's got an MIT and Stanford pedigree, and they just can't hang. And I said, oh, that's too bad. He said, so I was thinking, I had an idea. If I asked them if they thought that the class was going too quickly and they wanted to work at a slower pace, they could go in a second room and you would teach the class. I said, okay. And so then I began teaching teachers. So I've been teaching teachers since I was 19 years old. And there's 2 remarkable things about that experience. One was the only 2 people who, despite all the complaining, put their hands up to say, yeah, we want to go into the slower class, were 2 school secretaries. So I was teaching logo programming to school secretaries, which had absolutely no practical application for them. And I kept peeking around the corner to see what the other guy was teaching. And it was fantastic. And it turned out he was a professor at Rutgers, and I was a student at Rutgers. And we started chatting in the parking lot, and he said, why don't you take my class? And I ended up taking 3 semesters of doctoral classes with him when I was an undergrad. And, and then I met people like Dan Watt and Seymour Papert and Cynthia Solomon, and started speaking at conferences. And so I've been doing essentially what I do today for a very long time, for 43 years.
Well, for those folks that are watching on the YouTube channel, they can see your wonderful background with a lot of the books that you've written. Can you talk a little bit about some of the most inspiring things you've seen in a classroom?
Related to the books or not? I mean, I've had a couple lucky bounces, and I often think now, hindsight, that I peaked too early. When I got interested in educational technology, because that's where the wisest, most radical educators were. And I've been able to work with and know and carry on the legacy of most of the great progressive educators of the last half of the 20th century. My great friend and colleague and mentor, Seymour Papert, Cynthia Solomon, who's the mother of educational computing. I've worked with Herb Cole and Deborah Meyer and Alfie Cohn, and the list goes on and on. Carlo Rinaldi, Leila Gandini, Lillian Katz. And most inspiring things I've seen with kids, I mean, I was running around for a while saying, how can we possibly have a K-12 computer science curriculum when we have no idea what a 12th grader would be able to do if they started in kindergarten? And I was fairly smug and proud of that statement, and I was making it routinely until my friend Cynthia Solomon said, of course we know what kids are capable of doing. They're capable of surprising us. So, I can get back to my own specific work in a moment, but one of the greatest things I've ever seen is my favorite school in the world, Spenceley Street Primary School in Melbourne, Australia, a P-6 or K-6 school that's still open plan, that's 4 teachers in a space with 80 kids from kindergarten or prep, they call it, to 6th grade, working on personally meaningful projects with no special particular faculty or budget. Every 2 years, a group of 6th graders goes camping for a week, and during the camping trip, they write a musical, and they come back and they compose the score, and they design the sets and the costumes, and they rehearse the play, and then over 3 nights, they present the musical that they've written and composed, and they include in the cast or in the chorus every single kid in the school. So one of the reasons why they do it over 3 nights is that the kids with the speaking parts are in all 3 productions. But the kids in the chorus or the dancers are switched every night. So every kid gets to participate. Every kid gets to pull scenery or paint something or make costumes or be in the orchestra. And I'd wanted to see the musical for years. And about 4 years ago, I finally got my opportunity. And I just landed after 14 hours of flying, and I walked an hour, and I took public transit, and I got there, and I was worried about staying awake. And I knew it would be cute. But what stunned me was how moving it was and how clever it was and how good it was. And when I showed video of the production to my own grandchildren, who were about 5 and 8 at the time, they not only watched 90 minutes of other children their age performing an insane musical that had cats from outer space and crypto schemes and AI and a entire song and dance number about the importance of welcoming immigrants that was built on the metaphor of we should accept all cookies. Cue the 5-year-olds who come out dancing as cookies. They watched 90 minutes of it. And then 2 nights later, we're in the bath singing some of the songs that had been written by these other children. And you walk through the school and the kids are singing the songs and they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And it's, like I said, it's not only cute, but it's good. And it just points to the kind of remarkable capacity for intensity that children have. They can do things that are great and grand and bigger than themselves. That one of the lessons I learned from my colleagues at Reggio Emilia is it's more important to learn as a group than in a group. And so, I mean, that's one of my favorite experiences. And you can imagine in this political climate how an open plan school that does things like this is subject to mockery and constantly under threat. And when I take visitors to see this miraculous school that's survived the vicissitudes of political insanity for 50 years, I always tell them as we approach the front door, what you're about to see doesn't exist. It's impossible. So that's the kind of thing that excites me. My own work has been largely around educational computing because it adds colors to the crayon box. It allows for a broader, rich and a broader range and depth of projects to be possible than ever existed before. It allows kids to explore domains and express knowledge and collaborate in ways that were unimaginable just a few years ago. But it's all rooted in a serious progressive tradition and the fact that I was at the tail end of teacher education that was still focused on the art of teaching. And I mean, that's something we can talk about, but I think that the rise of this science of learning stuff is just a form of pedagogical authoritarianism. And the only antidote to it is reanimating the art of teaching. When I studied to be an elementary school teacher, we had to, by law, you had to learn how to play the piano a little bit. And we make math manipulatives and engage kids in projects and create classroom centers and teach phys ed and history and science and art. And around the mid-'80s, everywhere in the world, in your country, in my country, in Australia, in the UK, politicians decided, hey, teaching ain't nothing. All you need is animal control and curriculum delivery. And all that sort of magic of teaching, about the relationships, about the connections between disciplines, about the complexity of the universe, of working on something that's meaningful and matters to you, like really getting to know each child and what they're capable of doing and understand their thinking, has sadly disappeared. And that's not an indictment of teachers. That's an indictment of the system. And a lot of my work is these days and until my end of days, going forward, is about returning the art of teaching to the practice.
Well, I think you give us some really useful concepts to work with. So this distinction that you really make between, I think you call like pedagogical authoritarianism, which is really, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but really a top-down prescription of how to teach, what to teach, when to teach. In contrast to
It's pre-Trump. I mean, I'll be really clear. It's pre-Trumpian.
right, it is.
I mean, it's a template for Trump. I mean, it's the I alone can fix it. We know what you need to know when you need to know it right?
Without considering all the myriad of factors that every jurisdiction is different. Students have different backgrounds, different learning, aptitudes and such. But can I ask you to contrast that with the art of teaching in the sense of how can we reclaim that? Because I think, or I know a lot of the folks listening here, the audience again is made up mainly of, edtech professionals that are really becoming or founding companies, not really because they think it's the way for $1 billion exit. I think they know very well that when you're in education, it moves at a different pace. They're trying to reform the system. The other part of the audience are superintendents that are sitting in these chairs where they can influence change. So what does reclaiming the art of teaching look like?
Well, the first thing I would say is that your list of the problems was excellent. I would add to that list that the pedagogical authoritarianism lacks empathy. That even if it's not malicious, right? I like this example. We're taking public schools and we're turning them into private playthings in the hands of oligarchs and billionaires who want to all have a bright idea about how schools should be. And I don't think Bill Gates is evil. I just think he lacks empathy, for example. So this is a real. I'm going to get some of the details slightly wrong, but I remember a number of years ago, Gates discovered some history book he really liked. And he was so excited about it that because he's Bill Gates, he was able to get the author on the phone. And he said, I just love your work and this is fabulous. And then he thought, you know what, kids should have access to this. So instead of sort of pausing and displaying a bit of humility, he said, I know what I'll do. I'll call governors across the United States and tell them they should pass a law that every kid needs to be taught history this way. What he could have said was, hey, any teacher who wants to do this or has kids that might be interested in it, I'll make the materials available for you for free. So they jumped to a system of one size fits all that's about power and dominance and compliance and control. I think that the project should be a teacher's smallest unit of concern. We need to, when I was working with Seymour Papert, we created a multi-age, interdisciplinary, project-based, high-tech alternative school inside of a troubled prison for teenagers, a place where the state was being accused of torturing kids. And we let kids work 5 hours a day, uninterrupted on personally meaningful projects, and had remarkable success. And I remember early in the project, I was still looking at what we were doing through school-colored glasses. And Papert asked me one day, rather casually, what are you thinking about doing with the kids next? And I said, well, we were thinking about doing some geography. And he shot back, and what can they do with that? And I was kind of taken aback. And he said, I didn't mean to startle you, but what you do with the children should have a reasonable likelihood of leading towards the construction of a larger theory or a deeper question. Otherwise, why do it? And so I'm a big fan of what can they do. And I don't think our metrics for success are adequate or realistic. I don't think we know what greatness looks like or tastes like or feels like. I think that a school has an obligation to introduce children to things they don't yet know they love and to create the conditions in which they might become really good at those things. And my best advice to administrators these days, it's like really simple, but I think it turned out to me to be quite profound. Because I was observing some classrooms and I thought to myself, wow, if I was that teacher, I would drive my car off a bridge on the way home. I certainly I certainly wouldn't be able to come back tomorrow and do it again. And I remember thinking, how did I was kind of marveling at it. Like, how did they come back and do this again? And so what can I do observing that classroom that's going to have an impact right away? Aside from sacking the teacher, that's not a solution, or being punitive. And I've reduced it to a single question of asking, how do you think that went? How do you think that went? Because I see the kids asleep. I see the kids swinging from the chandeliers. I see, if I can give two quick anecdotes. One, we were involved in a project around STEM and robotics and stuff in a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn about 10 or 15 years ago. And I went to visit the teachers 3 months after we had done the professional development workshops. And there was this teacher, Sheila. Sheila was an older teacher. She was beloved in the community. She liked the kids liked her. Sheila liked teaching rocks and minerals. She was probably really good at teaching rocks and minerals. And as long as she was teaching rocks and minerals, everything was swell. Well, someone in the Department of Education got the bright idea that she should now teach physics. So now she doesn't know physics. So now she's got a faith-based relationship with the textbook where she's trying to pronounce the words like Trump is trying to pronounce, acetaminophen. And the kids are starting to get fidgety, and then she gets mad at the kids, and then the kids get more fidgety, then she gets madder at the kids. And over time, they no longer love Miss Sheila so much, and Miss Sheila doesn't love the kids quite so much because we decided physics at 7th grade was more important than rocks and minerals. We couldn't leave well enough alone. Or we couldn't build a bridge between those two for her by showing some empathy and paying attention to what was actually happening. I was in a classroom last year where I watched a teacher, start out by saying, we're going to do our 2-minute math warm-up. And the 2-minute math warm-up took 17 minutes. And then she started in on the lesson about money. And she asked the 2nd graders, what kinds of money are there? And the kids said, coins and notes and digital currency and crypto. And then the teacher was showing some frustration, and she said, and she wasn't getting a response. And then she picked up the marker and then she took the cap off the marker and she walked to the whiteboard and she began to start drawing and then she wrote a C, and she was looking for checks. That it was apparently really critical that 2nd graders knew what checks were at that moment. And then it's the end of the period. And they're going to go on to something else that nobody cares about, neither the teacher nor the kids. And one of the things that I've observed that causes me great distress is, when I get hired to work with high schools, I go in with low expectations, right? They are what they are. They've got so much institutional inertia, and the structure can't be touched. And we blame all the acronyms for it, and all the, the devil makes us do it. And I get that. And primary schools were always my happy place. In a lot of ways now, primary schools are even more disappointing because they've abandoned that art of teaching. And when every 14 minutes the kids hear a bell and go on to another subject because they have to be with a math specialist, because apparently 1st grade math requires specialization. It turns out that you can't do anything meaningful. You can't make connections between disciplines. The kids don't get to spend enough time with each other or with a teacher to form any kind of relationships that matter. Yeah. And I think it's really corrosive that we've turned primary schools into community colleges.
So Gary, let me press you to be like as precise as you can. Like I'll start with my instincts on this. Mm-hmm. I kind of feel that the whole system is being held up by an outdated assessment methodology. Like I feel the end is kind of where we start. We teach that way especially in the States, by the way, and I know you have a lot of
Yeah.
experience internationally, but the States is really kind of the folks that are on the forefront of, uh, giving tests to kids like crazy. We don't do that anywhere near standardized testing like you do in the States. But we still here in Canada have the final assessments, especially when you get to high school, that the teachers are always teaching to that assessment. Is that where your inclinations would say you start to reform something like, instead of final tests or state exams or those kind of things, that we look to more a portfolio-based system where then project-based learning and all that, those kind of group dynamics and the art of teaching can then be reflected in the actual teaching?
Of course. And if you can't do that, then build a firewall around it. By the time a kid gets to be about 16 years old, you can let them know that they're in for a load of bullshit. And let them in on the joke and go, okay, well, that's the fun and games and the actual learning are done. Now you're trying to get ready for university. And I think that's a reasonable approach too. But you shouldn't let that interfere with what happens in first grade. Alfie Kohn calls it the better get used to it curriculum.
Right.
Your fifth grade has to suck because you won't believe what sixth grade is like. And I find that that's all rooted in mythology. In the United States, those test scores only matter if you want to go to one of a half dozen schools. And that's and that's all just based on creating an artificial caste system. It's not rooted in any reality. Like I said, I was an incredibly mediocre student, but back in the day, before the Common Application, before the internet made this easy for you to check off as many universities as you wanted, as long as you had mommy's credit card, your first job as a kid was finding a college that might accept someone as lazy as you. So I didn't apply to schools that I wasn't going to get into. It never occurred to me that I could go to Harvard. That was ridiculous. I think NYU's entire business model is based on rejecting kids $100 at an application at a time. They would be bringing in tens of millions of dollars a year by saying no to students for no particular reason. I mean, even in the United States, most of the really good schools don't require the SATs or ACTs anymore. They're optional. They interview kids. They look at their work. They always have. They want interesting students. And in defense of the U.S. system, which is a hard sentence to have come out of my mouth, there's greater pedagogical diversity at our higher education system than probably anywhere in the world. If you want to be in a class with 6 experts sitting at a table for 4 years, that exists. Or you could be at an Ivy League school where you're never going to meet a professor and you're going to have to see them with binoculars. In a lecture theater, that exists as well. Now, then the question becomes, what's wrong with us that we perpetuate this mythology? That we do everything possible to reinforce this boogeyman that may or may not actually exist. And that's problematic to me. I mean, I had an experience that hits close to home. A quasi-colleague of mine had invited me to their kid's bar mitzvah. Now, I say to quasi-colleague because we were so close, I didn't know she was married or have a kid until bar mitzvah time, which was actually delayed 2 years by the pandemic. So he was 15 when I met him. And went to the bar mitzvah, and the kid came out and played a drum solo. And I thought, well, that's awfully precious. And I asked his mom, is he interested in this? And she said, oh, yeah, he really likes playing the drums. I said, well, let me start taking him to some concerts. And I go to a lot of concerts, and I've been lucky enough to not only know all the great educators I wanted to know, but I have a lot of friends who are among the world's greatest jazz musicians. And I've learned more about learning from them than almost anybody else. And I started taking this kid to concerts and taking him backstage and introducing him to people. And I helped him get into the Stanford Jazz Institute over the summer. And he started to develop social capital. And he would visit relatives in New York City and text message me at 1:00 in the morning. And I'd look on my phone to see who was playing where and tell him, get to the Village Vanguard now and sit next to the drum chair and tell him who you are. And the kid decided he wanted to study music at university. He's been attending private schools for the gifted since he was 2 years old, where he IQ tested into some ridiculous private school. Through his entire education, he's been told he's clever and he's bright. And he just sort of limped along and did what he had to do. And as soon as he got a drum teacher and started going to concerts with me and listening to music, he developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of jazz and the mechanics of it. And he was practicing for hours a day, and he was playing at jam sessions in the middle of the night, and he was doing better in school, and he was nicer to be around in the house, and he was finishing his chores. And his parents were thrilled with this, and he decided he wanted to go to university to study to be a jazz musician. And he had to make an audition tape for this. So I said to him, no one wants to listen to a 17-year-old playing the drums in their bedroom. Why don't you book a studio? I'll help you put a trio together, and you'll make a proper audition tape. And the kid had to find a studio and work the schedule out. I got him a friend of mine who is a 14-time Grammy-nominated pianist, who was one of few, who said he'd play on the kid's audition tape for free. And then I started with they need the charts. What's the date? Have you had a rehearsal? And I was getting radio silence, and he wasn't getting back to me, and this wasn't happening. And he shows up. He shows up at the recording session. He's the last one to arrive. The two professional musicians beat him there. He doesn't have any music. I put my arm around him and I said, I know you're under a lot of pressure, so I'm going to kick your ass next month, but let's get through this right now. And he made the audition tape, and he played great, and he got into all the best jazz programs in America. Now, his school, which is 1,000% dedicated to getting kids into university, did nothing to prepare this kid for his life. Not only did they do nothing, that they don't have a music program in the school because, that doesn't matter. But the month that applications and auditions tapes had to be submitted, he had to make a shoebox diorama about the War of 1812, and he had to study for his Latin 413 midterm exam. And this is the best one of all. You're going to love this one, Jason. When I couldn't get him on the phone or to respond to an email or text message about applying to university for a week, it was because the wellness curriculum at his school required a digital cleanse during the month that all of this was due. Right? You can't make this stuff up. And the school has zero concept of what this kid knows and can do, and how complex it is, and how sophisticated, and how it's connected to the elders who are no longer with us, and how it bridges cultures and races and identities and styles and technical fluency and the habits of mind he's had to develop and the courage that he's shown in what he's chosen to do.
Yeah.
And it breaks my heart, absolutely breaks my heart. And this is in an elite, the top of the system where that pretends to care about wellness, that's preparing kids for the future, that's, making them future ready, and has role playing for, applying to university where, I got a B+ on a spelling test. Okay, you'll die a penniless virgin. That's part of the role playing.
So Gary, let me.
Anyway, my frustration, you get it.
No, I do, and I kind of want to hone this criticism to what can be done. So, I know you've in the back you've got a book, I believe it's called The Learner's Apprentice, and you've obviously been investigating and been at the forefront of computing and education really since the onset. I think large language models right now are inevitably going to upend the entire system. Everything that we've structured in terms of what we've been discussing here, this rote kind of learning model, is going to be upended by AI. Now, with that comes, I think, a lot of turmoil, but I think the great potential to move to an education system that is really centered around, I think what you've been describing is human flourishing. Aspects that are good for the human, right? Because in everyday, who do we revere the most? Like musicians. Like, do you meet anybody that doesn't love music? Right? It's so crazy to me that everybody of every age, like they like their own genres and they love it enough, they explore all the other genres of music. But yet it's not something that we have part of every elementary school, which I agree with you is a complete travesty. I do feel, though, that we have the potential entering into this era where AI can do all the education tasks instantly and better than students can do them, that we have to reform the system, and it should be with the aims of human flourishing in mind, in the Greek sense, right? In the Aristotelian sense of, creating the well-formed citizen and the well-adjusted human. What are your thoughts on that? Do we have some hope there that we can, or we have to reform the system just simply because how good AI does all the old tasks?
Huh. Well, I'll start with a pessimistic view, and I'll get more optimistic. I keep seeing the meme about how math teachers protested calculator use 30, 40, 50 years ago in schools.
It's not the same.
And that's all. Well, it's not only not the same, but the math teachers won because the calculator had zero impact on math instruction. It's still debated whether you could use a calculator in some math classes or on some of those assessments you talked about, et cetera, around the world. So the institution's pretty strong and pretty immune and impervious to technological innovation. I'd love to be able to say that word processing had taken root in schools, but we're still endlessly talking about the benefits of using the ancient scratching stick. Can you imagine a sadder life than conducting research on whether handwriting helps one thing or another by, a tiny degree? I mean, it's pathetic to me. I think that we live in societies that can afford a cello and a laptop for every kid, and that ought to be the norm. I think going forward, administrators, educators, citizens, parents need to be able to answer the question of why do kids show up? How do we gain the greatest benefit from being co-located in the same space at the same time? Which is another way of saying how can schools remain viable? I used to say the only thing my kids didn't have at home was band. So as folks are concerned about the economy for STEM jobs softening, maybe it's time to lean into the arts. Maybe it's time to offer the kinds of experiences that kids couldn't get through an online quiz or watching a YouTube video. And specifically around AI and the Learner's Apprentice, which I'll talk about in a second, these ideas go way back. Two of the fathers of artificial intelligence were friends of mine, Seymour Papert and Marvin Minsky, and they started the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in the 1960s. And the folks who were there at the time said that terms like computational making were being discussed. And they used to have as an unofficial motto that computers are for children. And the idea was that, rooted in Piaget, because Papert helped Piaget understand how children learn mathematics, having had a couple PhDs in mathematics at the time, that if you could teach a computer to think like a child, you would understand how thinking occurs. And if a child could teach a computer to think, they would enhance their own thinking about thinking. And Papert used to say, you can't think about thinking without thinking about something. So he developed the Logo programming language and other environments that allowed kids to be engaged in computational work, to be mathematicians rather than being taught math, to be historians rather than being taught history, to be musicians rather than being taught about music, etc. And you want kids to be able to develop computational fluency. And it's clear that this AI stuff is going to have dramatic impact on every walk of life. It may just not. Schools may not change at all. They just may become increasingly irrelevant, which is problematic. And I'm really concerned by the level of both hype and hysteria around AI in education. I've been through plenty of gold rushes and fads in education, but I've never seen anything that caused everyone in the universe to change their LinkedIn bio overnight to read AI and education expert. And I'm concerned by the gullibility of customers for that. If artificial intelligence is a legitimate science, it'd be like you or I changing our bio to read geneticist or cancer researcher. And so that brings us to the Learner's Apprentice. I've known Ken Kahn forever. Ken was a graduate student at MIT in the early 70s. Seymour Papert was his doctoral supervisor. And so he's been thinking about learning and artificial intelligence and kids programming and computational fluency and making for a very long time. And when all the hype around ChatGPT emerged a few years ago, Ken did the same thing that I did, that kind of rational people do, which is start messing about with it, start playing with the thing and seeing if there's any there.
Yep.
And I mean, Scarcity will probably tell you one of my favorite tweets ever that I'm most proud of was I said, should I ignore Google Buzz or Google Wave more? And it turns out I won the exacta because I can't remember what either of them did. But as we were being told that this was the future of everything, my spidey sense said, this is a load of crap and it's not worth any attention. The large language models and the chat front ends seem to be different in that way. And I started off by using them in the same dopey way that a lot of people do, of thinking of it as an encyclopedia. And I remember staying up till 4 o'clock in the morning one night arguing with this chatbot about Maria Montessori and realizing that it was useless. But it's not an encyclopedia. It's just software. And so Ken started playing with it around the same time I did, and he's a lot smarter than I am, and he started sharing on social media these incredibly elaborate simulations, models, problems that he was solving with this prosthetic device of AI. And I said, hey, you interested in writing a book? And despite the fact that he had been an academic for a half century, he had never published a book before. And with my partner, Sylvia Martinez, we helped bring this book, The Learner's Apprentice, to life. And I'm incredibly proud of it because it's not only filled with insanely creative, clever, playful, wondrous things to do with AI, but it helps set a tone for this stuff won't be the same tomorrow. Your mileage will vary. But having the mindset to be receptive to the possibility that Papert said everyone needs a prosthetic. We're both wearing glasses. No one accuses us of cheating. And we use technology all day, every day that helps us get through our lives. And this is like a quantum step forward, even if it has some downside, even if it does dopey things, even if it hallucinates from time to time. But I fear that the stuff that schools are arguing over is the least significant part of the affordances of AI. There's an influencer, and I won't name any names, but they post lots of photos of rolling around in scantily clad in hotel linen, with their hot takes on how the world is changing because of AI. And the other day, the innovation was writing sub plans. Really sub plans. This is top of mind for teachers. This is really sub plans. This is the best we can do. Or the fantasies that we're going to teach kids long division quicker because they have access to a chatbot. So it's all this sort of low level nonsense that schools shouldn't spend any time worrying about to begin with. That there's a danger of sustaining, preserving, calcifying going forward. But the stuff that it lets you do is remarkable, and it gets better every day. And I use it constantly. There's going to be issues of, I mean, my greater concerns are issues around pricing and accessibility than
For sure. Just
whether it works or not.
Yeah.
And schools also endlessly, people went to jail for this in Australia. The internet heated up. Newspapers were filled with stories about the internet. TV was talking about the internet. Kids, of course, were using the internet. And one of the state governments in Australia said, hey, this internet thing really has some potential. It'd be even better if we made one. And I remember, you're going to make the internet? You're a bunch of mediocre bureaucrats. Really? Just like making AI policy, something you couldn't spell a week ago. Okay, so we're gonna let you do this work. And that's a great idea. They actually went to prison over it. It was such a debacle. And the same thing is happening now with we couldn't use ChatGPT or Claude, or we have to use Claude, which will be the Toronto, whatever. Oh, it's just preposterous. Let's find creative ways. One of the lessons I learned from the incredibly wise, subtle, beautiful, complex, human-centered educators of Reggio Emilia, Italy is it is irresponsible to build pens around children. It's incumbent upon adults to find ways to constructively engage them with their world. And one of the things I'm most excited about in my work, you started with that 4 days ago when we began this conversation, is the relationship that I've established and began and it continued to develop with the educators of Reggio Emilia. And I'm excited to announce that we ran an institute in April called The Language of Computation, Constructing Modern Knowledge, which is my approach to project-based learning and constructionism and making with technology in Reggio Emilia. That was the culmination of 15 years of begging, bribing, cajoling, traveling to Italy, crawling on my hands and knees, begging for this collaboration. We did it in April. It happened, and we've been invited to return in June. So June 15th to 19th, we're going to be offering a remarkable learning adventure for educators from around the world in the City of Children in Reggio Emilia, Italy. If you're interested in that, you can go to reggio.constructingmodernKnowledge.com. But it would never occur to those people who really love children to try to build a wall between them and the world in which they inhabit, because it is in fact their world as well as it is ours.
So Gary, if I can ask you to give me two visions of the future, given where we are, and I'll let you go with both politically and technologically. If you give me two visions for the futures, one utopian and one dystopian, what would they look like? Let's start with the dystopian first, so we end on a higher note.
That's why the wheels in my head were going in that direction as well. I think greater deprivation, school becoming less and less reflective of the world in which we live, public institutions being dismantled, apathy growing, divisiveness growing. I mean, what I learned about the world and civil rights and race and tolerance and humanity because I wanted to be a jazz musician, it is incalculable. And so you never know the path that kids are going to take. And so there are, and then we lack any coherent vision for how computers are being used in schools. Now educational technology seems to be anything with a battery or a plug attached to it. When even in the 70s, there were legitimate intellectual arguments about which constituent group the computer was intended to benefit, whether it was the system, the teacher, or the kid. And I think the greatest return on investment is using the computer as an intellectual laboratory and vehicle for self-expression that provides maximum agency and opportunities for creativity and personal expression and collaboration and democracy on behalf of learners, as opposed to filling their heads with content or testing them endlessly or measuring their mood, for God's sakes. All these sort of artificial systems that are incredibly expensive. You're worried about a kid's mood. Well, why don't you ask them about it, or sit next to them, or look at their work, or, I'm concerned about the spiral. I call it the teacher agency spiral, that we remove agency from teachers, and then their practice becomes more mechanized, thoughtless, and then the results suffer. And so the system responds by removing more agency from them. And the technology and its intersection with politics and money create an opportunity to have exacerbating our social ills and reinforcing a racial and socioeconomic caste system that I find really unpleasant. On the other hand, education no longer needs to be a scarce resource. And, you go to most university campuses and they're pitch dark at 4 p.m., which is preposterous. Harvard could admit 50 times more students. Why
Easily.
don't they? Because their brand is scarcity.
Yeah.
But if you're a state institution, you should be running 24/7. Every Uber driver who wants to take a class, every mother who wants to earn a degree, think about the sunk costs to the university, just the physical plant that they're leaving dark. It breaks my heart. There's no reason for it. And it blows people's minds when I say to them, what if you just let anyone in? They either do the work or they don't do the work. What's the big deal there? And from a leadership and a vision perspective, when I present what kids are capable of doing and my vision of how computers can be used to amplify the best of who we are as humans, and we could blur the artificial boundaries between subject areas, and project could be a teacher's smallest unit of concern, and kids could dedicate 6 months every 2 years to producing a musical. And I share that with parents. They say, hell yeah, absolutely. When they see through the eyes and the hands and the screens of their kids what's possible, they want a different educational diet for their children. That's why I love running family workshops. When parents are collaborating with their kids and they're involved in computational making or programming or making a robot that does something, they go, of course, this is what we want for our kids. When I was involved in my doctoral research in the prison for teenagers, I fully expected that when we took the most at-risk kids into society and we abandoned the curriculum entirely, every visitor would say, but how do you know they're learning? What do the test scores show you? And I don't have a lot of quantitative data, but I do know that in 3.5 years, we didn't have a single kid who had to leave the classroom for discipline reasons. We had kids who we were told were illiterate who spent a few months with us and went to university afterwards. And every visitor who came to the prison classroom, I used to refer to it like Gilligan's Island. We had so many visitors, and they arrived every day, and they got out, but none of the kids ever did. They would walk into our classroom, Jason, and Billy or Mary would come up to them and say, "Hi, I'm Billy. Want to see what I'm working on?" And then Billy would show an adult what they were working on and talk to them about it for 45 minutes. And they all left saying, of course, this is what we should be doing for kids. So people can't choose from what they haven't seen. We have to create compelling models. At the very least, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom. Why does every school have to be the same? Why does every classroom have to be the same? Maybe we create some temporary inequities so that we can allow people to find a path to a future for their children that actually serves them and us and the planet. There's bookshelves behind me. When a school principal or superintendent says to me, if only we knew what to do, I said, swing by my house. I have a few thousand books I can lend you. Every problem in education has been solved somewhere before. We just need the courage to do the right thing by kids and to create models that are not only sustainable, but that people will choose. I want to live in a world where kids wake up in the middle of the night with a burning desire to get back to school, to continue working on something that matters to them, and where their teachers wake up every morning and say, hey, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life?
Here, I've got a few more questions for you before I let you go.
Sure.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this, because my brother-in-law is quite the accomplished jazz musician. you've published books on education and jazz separately.
Yeah.
What can jazz teach us about teaching and learning?
Um, Individual excellence in a group context, learning by doing, improvisation, democracy, um, focusing on details, while keeping your eye on the bigger picture. A combination of heart and soul and mind and and body. And the thing that the jazz musicians have in common with the great educators is they delight in the company of people who want to preserve and continue what it is that they do. And the greatest jazz musicians alive are the ones that are, I go on a jazz cruise some years where there's 100 or so of the best musicians in the world on a boat with a couple thousand patrons for a week. And you get to spend a lot of time together if you choose to. And one of the things I've noticed over time is the real masters are the ones who are up at 8 o'clock in the morning watching the college kids who are playing their first professional gig, who were brought on because they're all-stars or something. They're checking out the young people. And they're not just checking them out for sort of competitive reasons. They're checking them out because it fills them with pride and hope and optimism that what they've committed their life to is in good hands. That the young people will preserve what it is that we love. And Dennis Littke and his colleagues created the big picture. Elliot Washer created the big picture schools. Schools where kids don't even go to school Tuesdays and Thursdays. The curriculum Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is whatever they need to know to be able to engage in their internships Tuesdays and Thursdays more effectively. And they have a mentor for 4 years who they apprentice with. And I remember asking, how do you find these people who are willing to volunteer to work with kids for 4 years? And Dennis saying to me, are you kidding? It's the easiest thing in the world. People who love what they do love to be around young people who love what they do. So I've used the word love a lot, but I think love is a better master than duty. And I spill with joy and optimism when I'm in the company of musicians who are doing something that's insanely complicated. I marvel at my adolescent and 20-something arrogance to think that I could have possibly done something that complex at any point in my life. But I'm sure glad that other people sort of climbed that mountain and we all benefit from it. And so legacy, connection, joy, excellence. Like I said before, I think our metrics for success are really impoverished. And one of the goals at my Constructing Modern Knowledge Summer Institute for 15 years was every year we had a YouTube filmmaker, Casey Neistat, a treehouse designer, an astrophysicist, a video game composer, an 18-year-old kid who was the world's leading authority on Negro League baseball history. Folks who were incredibly successful at something your guidance counselor didn't even consider an option were always one of our speakers, because I wanted teachers to be reminded or introduced to the idea of what excellence looks like. And I had an experience at the last CMK that we ran. Stephen Wolfram, arguably the world's most important living mathematician, computer scientist, just ridiculous. Had a PhD at 19, a MacArthur Genius at 20. He's created the software that's powering most of the AI revolution. And he came to speak to teachers because he cares about his ideas continuing as well. And my 7-year-old grandson at the time walked into the session and sat in the front row. And I got a little nervous. And then 1 minute into Dr. Wolfram's presentation, Theo's hand went up and I got really nervous. And for the better part of half the presentation, Theo and Dr. Wolfram engaged in a conversation about computation and mathematical ideas with
That's
a room full of
amazing.
educators just watching. And until his mother dragged him out and told him he had to write his questions down. And we have the sheet of paper somewhere. The questions are all really good. But there was, the best jazz musicians, the best mathematicians, the best historians, the best scientists, the best politicians possess a playfulness and a sense of wonder that's shared by, by definition, that's what the musicians are made of.
My last question for you, Gary, is if I gave you a magic wand and you can do anything to the public education system, what would you do? And it's all powerful, I should say, Gary. All powerful magic wand.
I think we first of all make sure kids had access to high interest reading materials, that there were musical instruments, that every kid had a computer that was theirs. I mean, when we launched one-to-one computing 35 years ago, we used the term personal computing because it mattered. It was yours. Nobody washes a rental car. Your ideas were made in it, and because of that, you took care of it, and it was yours. I think we would break down the artificial boundaries between age segregation. Papert used to say we group kids by similar levels of incompetence. There'd be longer periods of time to work on things that matter, to the extent that you think there's specific things that every kid needs to do. Try to keep that as focused and short and tight and isolated from the actual learning experiences as possible. I know that when I hire teachers, on the odd occasion that I've been in a position to hire teachers, the one item that makes a resume or CV jump to the top of the pile is worked at summer camp. And a reason for that is summer camp is the place where when it rains for 4 straight days and you're told you have to stand with 28-year-olds at a ping pong table until Thursday and make sure no one gets hurt, you can find some constructive way of engaging with the kids. And you didn't do it for money, and you didn't do it for fame or power. This wasn't because you wanted to be you couldn't get that dream job of being a prison warden or managing a 7-Eleven. But it was because you actually wanted to spend time in the company of young people. And so I think we could learn an awful lot about what school could be if we looked at the best summer camps. Well,
As someone who ran summer camps for the majority of my 20s, I couldn't agree more. Gary Steger, thank you very much for your time.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.